In April 2018, 25-year-old Alec Manassian mowed down more than 24 Toronto pedestrians with his van, killing 10. A self-described incel, Manassian was inspired by Elliot Rogers, whose own mass killing was, according to the latter's manifesto, similarly motivated by deep resentment of female rejection. The incel rebellion has already begun. Manassian posted on Facebook just before his killing spree. We will overthrow all the Chads and Stacys. All hail the supreme gentleman, Elliot Roger, which is sort of like incel speak for incel. Soon after, University of Toronto psychologist and public intellectual Jordan Peterson was asked by the New York Times journalist Nellie Bowles for his thoughts about the tragedy, and he said he was angry at God because women were rejecting him. The cure for that is enforced monogamy. That's actually why monogamy emerges. Mr. Peterson does not pause when he says this, Bowles writes. Enforced monogamy is to him simply a rational solution. Otherwise, women will all only go for the most high status men, he explains. And that couldn't make either gender happy. Half the men fail, he says, meaning that they don't procreate. And no one cares about the men who fail. I laugh, she writes, because it is absurd. You're laughing about them, he says, giving me a disappointed look. That's because you're female. In a situation where there's too much mate choice, a small percentage of the guys have hyper access to women, and so they don't form relationships with women. And women hate that. Now, Peterson's endorsement of enforced monogamy drew the ire of the commentariat, many of whom interpreted the phrase as a sort of Handmaid's Tale type scenario or associated it with the crudest forms of sexual coercion. So he responded to this and online and in a bunch of interviews and so forth. And here's how he defends himself. So let's summarize. Men get frustrated when they are not competitive in the sexual marketplace. And he says, I'm not defending it, I'm just saying they do. Frustrated men tend to become dangerous, particularly if they are young. And this dangerousness has to be regulated by society, he goes on, okay? And he says, look, I'm not talking about, parceling out women to incels. He says, I'm just giving you the quote, plain, bare common sense facts. Socially enforced monogamous conventions decrease male violence. In addition, and not trivially, they also help provide mothers with comparatively reliable male partners and increase the probability that stable, father-intact homes will exist for their children. So our question is whether he's basically right. If he's wrong, where's he wrong? Okay. What's the best case for thinking Jordan Peterson is right when he makes this assertion? Right for thinking that enforced monogamy, which is also called normative monogamy, is a good remedy for an overabundance of sexless males. I'll begin with what I take to be, if not his moral premise, what a type of moral premise that you hear a lot in these circles, okay? It's not a conservative Christian premise. It's sort of socially pragmatic premise that goes something like this. Look, we're worried about the rising rates of male sexlessness that's connected with rising with a decrease in marriage, decreases in, as we'll see, sex across the board. And we're worried about the societal or even civilizational impacts of this. Is it sort of civilizationally unstable or unsustainable? And taking a page from the sustainability literature with regard to the environment, we can worry about our sort of social ecology. Okay. The sort of social ecology that you need to have a civilization, or at least our civilization. And if we need to, in order to maintain civilization, put some curbs or constraints on freedom, sexual freedoms or reproductive freedoms than we do for the same reasons that we're used to putting curbs on our freedoms with regard to the environment. So something like our prima facie sexual or reproductive liberty rights. So we really have sexual reproductive rights, moral rights, say, but they're prima facie, they're outweighable, okay? They may be moderated for the sake of civilizational sustainability. So let's go with that premise. Any moral premise is hugely controversial, and I'm more than happy to talk about that one. But actually, that's not where a lot of the debate in this talk is going to be about. When you talk about enforced monogamy, sorry, I have a cold. When you talk about enforced monogamy, that is a sort of two-front war, okay? You have to, he's talking about, in contrast to traditional polygamy, okay, monogamy versus polygamy. And it's from that he's getting some of his evidence for thinking that it's worrisome that there's so many unattached young males. But he's applying it to a different realm, which is our own, a socially monogamous society. We're not a polygamous society, or at least not yet. So a socially monogamous society, but that has a sort of unregulated mating system. So, people could have sex with multiple people at the same time, could be serially monogamous, whatever. Okay, so sort of sexually liberated mating regime. All right, so we're going to have to look at both. Let's look at polygamy first. The best case against polygamy, I think, comes from Joe Henrich, who's a really big deal. He's a biologist, a sort of economist, a psychologist, or wears a lot of hats. He, back when he was in University of British Columbia, he wrote a friend of the court brief to the Supreme Court of British Columbia, arguing that they should not legalize polygamy in Canada. Okay, and this grew into a major co-authored paper called The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage. It plays a big role in his recent important book, The Weirdest People in the World: How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. Some things that he shows that he and his collaborators show or claim is that, polygamous societies, most human societies, depending on how you divide them, have been polygamous, maybe 70%, maybe 80%. And it is not uncommon in these societies for about 40% of men to not have a mate. And being unmarried, even holding various variables fixed, basically doubles a man's chance of violent criminality. And places, he shows that places can, sometimes even in the same country, but one community will be polygamous, one won't. Places with more unmarried men have more rape and murder. Unattached men will spend more time in dissolute pastimes like drinking and drugs, whereas if they're married, if they're having kids, they're hustling to make money for their wives and kids. Polygamous societies are significantly more politically unstable. And you could see why. If elite males are sort of monopolizing all the women, then they have to get more despotic to their unhappy underclass of males. So you're going to get more authoritarianism. And the shut out males who don't have wives will get more revolutionary, right? I mean, from the most, one of the most basic human motives is to reproduce. So if you feel like you're being shut out of any sort of chance to pass on your genes, you're going to get more radical politics. You're going to do what you're going to be more criminal, be more radical politically. You're going to do whatever you need to upend society. If you die in the revolution or whatever, no big deal. You're not going to pass on your genes anyway. But if you win, you may end up in the top half or whatever and end up with a woman. Polygamous societies have less male parental investment. So roughly speaking, because everything I'm talking about here is in mass generalities. Okay, I'm not talking about any particular person. I know polygamous people who are great dads, but generally in polygamous societies, you're going to have less parental investment of the children. So even the men who are winning, the men who do have wives and kids, will spend less time with those kids, partially because they have more kids, partially because they're out hustling for more wives. Okay, so I mean, that's the thing you have to keep in mind in a polygamous society. All the men are on the market all the time. All right, and so men will divert a lot of their energy that they would spend on their careers to make more money or whatever to provide for their kids. They, instead they're not going reading in bed with their kids, right? They're going to be out, kind of seeing what they could do to get another wife. Women will be, there's this huge pressure on young women, right? Because not only is it the single guys that are after them, but the married men who are after them. So there's a huge sort of, I guess, a sort of scramble is the only word for it, for young women, which decreases the incentive that they have to get educated. They'll get married earlier and earlier because the longer they're out, the more in danger they are. So you want to get them married as soon as possible, and secure and safe. That means kids earlier, less education, less sort of freedom to have careers, etc. Because there's such a scramble for young women, it's more dangerous for them, rape-wise, etc. So you get more mate guarding behavior. Chaperone culture, always be around a man. To some degree, female genital cutting, which there's a pretty profound overlap between polygamous societies and female genital cutting, is a sort of mate guarding tactic to sort of, if you're away from your young wives for too long, it behooves you to make sure sex is not very enjoyable for them. Okay, so that's, a very quick summary of some of the downsides civilizationally of polygamy. And given how many practices are thought to be environmentally sustainable, I just noticed I'm drinking from a metal straw, right? Because plastic straws are unsustainable. My university doesn't have plastic straws because they're unsustainable. All right, so if plastic straws are sort of environmentally unsustainable, then it's not hard to see that polygamy would count as sort of civilizationally unsustainable too. Is it possible to have a civilization that's polygamous? Yes, it's a drag on civilization, right? You have to make up for it, perhaps profoundly in other ways. So maybe Henrich is right. Maybe we should not legalize polygamy because of the monopolization of females by elite males and the perverse incentive structures that creates. Okay, but what about the other side of this? Well, sexlessness in young men in America is rising. This got a lot of press in 2018 when we saw a dramatic spike in men, young men who should be, who you think would be having the most sex, reporting no sex in the past year, 28%. I'm curious to see what the most recent, when the most recent studies come out, what, if that continues up. There is a bit of a sex recession going on. It is mostly driven by the young and young men in particular. And this has gotten a lot of press, okay, in the last 2 years. And I wrote down, these are all reputable sources, some cited causes. No one really knows like everything that's going on, right? We're just still trying to figure out what's going on. But one of the biggest causes is just people are marrying less and marrying later when they do. So the marriage, in the last couple of years, we've seen the lowest marriage rates ever in America. And so if people are getting married less, they're having less sex because people who are married have more sex. This is probably one of the big drivers of this, perhaps, is because young people feel like they're not financially ready to get married until later and later. Less alcohol use is not a joke. Generation Z and millennials drink less alcohol than previous generations did, and alcohol has its downsides. One is maybe sex that you regret, but it has upsides, which is sex, I guess. Obviously we have a very unfavorable housing market. Housing is getting more expensive. Students are saddled with more student loans, so they're living at home, and that's bad for one's sex life. Young men have worse economic prospects than they did, for the boomers, especially, of course, who had the most sex of any generation. Antidepressant use is a big one, probably, which antidepressant use is rather high, and that lowers libido. This is especially affecting young women. Obesity is probably a cause. Again, there's going to be a feedback here, but if people are not feeling sexy or feeling attractive or whatever, they're less likely to be looking to have sex. A lot of commentators say that, well, hookup sex, we'll be talking more about short-term sexual relationships, but hookup sex is worse for women. And that seems backed up by the science, in that if you look at orgasm frequency is higher in long-term relationships for women. Female orgasms are high, have much more likely in a long-term relationship than in a hookup scenario. Young men being worried about being too pushy or aggressive, or being accused of sexual harassment. So there was an interesting Pew poll a couple of years ago asking young women about a bunch of different behaviors. A guy compliments you, a guy asks you on a date, etc. Is this sexual harassment? Is it not? Whatever. And we saw in a very kind of predictable linear way, the younger the female respondents, the more likely they were to say that something that a previous generation would find completely innocuous, like being told you're beautiful or something like that, is sexual harassment. So if you have something like 25% of young girls thinking they've been sexually harassed if they've been complimented, that's going to scare the bejesus out of a lot of young men. Lower testosterone rates are going down, so maybe young men are less libidinal. Cell phone and video game addiction is real, and you have a lot of couples laying in bed. This one may be affecting a lot of married couples, the cell phone addiction. Husband and wife are just laying in bed looking at their phones instead of being bored enough to have sex. And possibly more and more young people are on the autism spectrum, making it harder for them to sort of pick up on social cues. Okay, so a lot of these things, all right, a lot of these things have nothing to do, or at least not directly anything to do, with intrasexual competition from elite males. Okay, so it's hard to see that it's just the top guys just sucking up all the female attention. All right. Nonetheless, it is true that intrasexual male competition in an unregulated sex market could result in some of the same downsides that we see in traditional polygamous marriage systems. And this is the type of thing that incels. Now, when I say incels, I don't mean all involuntary celibates. Incels are sort of like it's a bit of a pejorative, it's a bit of a political identity. But so the class of people who are just presently unlucky in love or something like that are not what we should call incels. But among actual incels, they do focus a lot. And when the thing we're kind of worried about is, are they obsessing over excessively intrasexual competition among men? So let me give you my best effort to sort of get at what they're worried about, and then we could talk about whether you think that's an actual problem. All right, so Here's the story. Well, thanks to birth control and safe sex practices and liberal sex ethics, the costs of sex are really low. And so you might think this would just lead to, mass orgies and so forth. We'd be having sex all over the place. At least young people would. And yet we're not seeing that, right? And so why aren't we seeing that? Well, part of it is for the reasons we've seen, right? Just everyone's living with their mom and dad after college and so forth. But it may have to do with these sorts of things incels worry a lot about, which are bifurcated mating markets, sexual strategy, specialization, and hypergamy. All right, so by bifurcated mating market, we mean this. Thanks to the pill and the economy opening up to women, women could go to work and so forth, and especially online dating, two rather distinct mating markets have emerged, okay? One is the short-term mating market, where you just have one-night stands or hookups or booty calls or friends with benefit relationships or flings, right? And then there's a second long-term mating market, which we'll consider marriage or at least cohabitation with kids. And so, why does this matter? Because different sorts of men excel in these different strategies. All right. So I assume we could talk about it in the Q&A if this is debatable, but I assume we all understand, even if we don't agree, at least you understand how this works. That in humans, like almost all mammals, females are the choosy sex vis-a-vis sex. So females are the gatekeepers of sex. Sex is costly for females, all right, at least the way we evolved. And it isn't like our brains have changed at all since the 60s. So sex is costly for females, and it still is more costly for females than males. So like STDs are easier to catch if you're a woman than a male. Okay, if you get pregnant, you're still one with baby and so forth. So sex is more costly for females, and they can have fewer offspring, right? And so because of this, females have to be choosy, and they're not, they're choosy about the same sort of things, right? They're attracted to status, provisioning ability, that is to say, power, wealth, and the willingness to provide. So it's not just that someone has power and wealth, but that they're willing to provide that, okay? That means commitment. And they're also worried about good genes, right? If you've only got a few shots of reproduction, unlike a male, you want to make sure those kids are winners, right? You want to make sure those kids have good genes. So you're attracted to, you're way more sexually attracted to males that seem like they have good genes. Way more interested in that than males are to females, who are more interested in just youthfulness. Now, when it comes to relationships or long-term relationships, men get way more choosy, but we're just talking about for short-term. So. What makes I guess we all know this, what makes somebody a good short-term mate, good fun for a night or a week or something like that, is different than what will make them a good long-term mate. I got these pictures off the web. This guy on the right here there's this show called Dads, I guess, and he's the dad in Dads. So that showed up when I put in dad, and I thought it looked pretty good for a dad. And I thought this guy on the left here looked just perfect for the role of a short-term. When I put myself in that girl mindset, maybe people can correct me, but he seemed we have all the signals here of short-term mating. Great genetics, but also doing he's flashing with the watch, the tattoos, culturally for us are indicators of short-term mating interest and so forth, right? So in a pre-bifurcated mating market, women are looking for this guy in the middle, right? This is a great, obviously fantastic genetics, very handsome, very sexy guy. He has, he's got his guitar in his hand. He's musical, he's talented, right? He'll pass on those talents to his children. That's great. You like that. But look, he seems so paternal. He's very interested in taking care of children, right? He's happy being married and locked down and so forth. So sure, that's the dream, right? That's the dream when you're ready to settle down. And that's the dream, maybe when you're being forced to settle down because the pill hasn't been invented yet or whatever. Okay, but in a world where you don't have to settle down just yet, you're more and more inclined to this guy here who is maybe more edgy and more fun and so forth. All right, so and there's a lot of psychology being done on dad versus cads and so forth. So this is kind of a real thing. In fact, women seem to even be able to identify men who are self-described cads versus dad strategists. So yeah, it's a thing. And then hypergamy, of course, we have the same dynamic as before. It isn't the case that elite males dominate women just because out of force or something like that. Women are attracted, and their parents are attracted to, and everything is pushing these girls to the elite males. But even when there's no forces at play, they're going to be attracted to the elite males. Okay, and so as incels quote unquote worry, and a lot of people in that manosphere worry, what's happening is that the cads are dominating the sexual marketplace for young women. Okay, and so there's not a lot of girls left for guys who are not guys who are like losers really, but they're just not short-term strategists. Okay, and so there's nothing left for them, and this depresses them. It bums them out, right? And so what we get is a sort of winner takes all marketplace, much like in maybe a free economy. And the way to think about monogamy is that it's a sort of socialism of women. And a lot of the critiques that incels are giving is sort of, well, kind of like people that are being shut out of the economic system, claiming that the economic system needs to be rearranged so that they have a way in, looking for a little more egalitarianism. Okay, so but in what we have now, this is, again, I'm continuing this narrative. What's going on? Well, life is great for those who are winners. This is an interesting link we could go to in the Q&A if it comes up, of 2019's Tinder's most successful men and women in 2019 in the UK. So life's great for them. It's a windfall of sex for these guys. But what about the guys who are being shut out? Well, they're just giving up. Unlike their counterpart in the 1950s, who would just be like, well, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to save up for a down payment on a house, and so forth, and be clean cut and really impress her parents and so forth. They have no hope of getting a girl, at least a young one, at least until they're much older, and then maybe they'll get a woman in her 30s, but not a girl in their 20s, which is far more desirable on the main market. So they're just dropping out, and they are going two ways. They are either trying to become cads themselves, right, hitting the gym and exercising a lot and trying to lose weight and putting a lot of tattoos on themselves, or doing whatever they can to signal, play that game and do it poorly. And girls have all sorts of negative names for these guys. Or they're just dropping out completely and abandoning themselves to escapist pursuits like, video games or pornography or whatever. And so they're, they feel like they have nothing to work for. And so we're seeing some of these same, the idea is that we would be seeing some of these same results as a polygamous society, although we're hardly polygamous. So the idea is that we need, some critics say, these men being hopeful, ambitious, responsible, and working on their civilizational building skills instead of just escapism. What happens to women in this sort of bifurcated mating market? Well, young women are forced to navigate a world in which, at their most marriageable in their 20s, their prospective mates are dividing up into short-term strategists who have no incentive to marry. Sex is too cheap. There are books being written, called Cheap Sex and so forth. Sex is too easy for them to have to feel like they have to commit to a woman to get. Even if they think a girl is a wonderful woman, it's hard for these successful chads or cads, and I do distinguish between those, but it's just going to be hard for them to want to commit when sex is so easy. And on the other hand, okay, so if you're not going to get in relationships, a bunch of short-term relationships with those guys, what do you do as a girl? Well, the rest of the guys maybe are just too dispirited and escapists and weirdo losers, and guys, there's a lot of concern about guys getting weirder, getting creepier and so forth, because they don't have a lot of experience talking to girls or going to school dances or courting. Now, is this actually happening, or is this just a fever dream, okay, of alt-right or incels? I don't know. I mean, we're still trying to figure this out. We don't really know. It's true that dating apps are increasingly important on the mating market, and it does seem that dating apps create a winner takes all dynamic. So here's like one study that showed that women, swipe, is it left? I don't know. I've never been on Tinder, but women just ignore 95% of guys, and they only are interested in like 4% of guys on Tinder, okay? Whereas guys are interested in like half of the girls, okay? So it's just a few guys are crushing it at Tinder, and it's mostly very difficult for the rest of the guys to get any sort of attention there. And there seems to be this, it seems to be sucking up all the oxygen in that, now, like I'm hearing people say, well, I feel like it's inappropriate to hit on a girl in public, or, start chatting up a girl in the bar in public because, well, there's a marketplace for that. It's called Tinder. And, you should look for her on Tinder, even if she's right across from you or something like that. Okay. So if that's happening, that marketplace could be driving this type of dynamic, but we just don't know. I mean, like, just because there's matches on Tinder doesn't mean people are actually getting together sexually. There's a lot of chatting going on that doesn't lead to anything. It's unclear whether the cads are really having a lot of sex with girls who wouldn't have had sex with them before, or whether they're just having sex with the same subgroup of promiscuous women. It is true that just a small percentage of men are having most of the sex that's being had, but it could be with just a small group of the most promiscuous women, and then the vast majority of women are not having a lot of sex at all. And indeed, again, the number of average sexual partners is going down even for women from the boomer years. So there's lots of conflicting data here, and no one, as far as I know, has figured out exactly what's going on. So to conclude, what is the best case for thinking Jordan Peterson is correct, for thinking that enforced monogamy or normative monogamy is a good remedy for an overabundance of sexless males? Here's my best shot. Premise one, our prima facie sexual reproductive liberty rights may be moderated for the sake of social and civilizational sustainability. I've already talked about that. Two, both polygamy and unregulated sexual markets are civilizationally unsustainable. Three, there is no consideration important enough to outweigh the prima facie permissibility of limiting polygamy and our sexual market in the requisite ways to make them sustainable. So we may morally place restrictions on polygamy and our sexual market in the requisite ways, whatever we mean by that, right? And that's what enforced monogamy would amount to. Okay. What do I think? Well, I think this principle seems right. Small rights infringements to liberty or to a culture's right to maintain its traditions and character for the sake of sustainability are more defensible than large infringements. And infringements for large benefits are more justifiable than those for small benefits. So it seems to me that for a socially monogamous society such as ours, banning polygamy would be a small infringement for a big civilizational benefit. There aren't a lot of people yet polygamy in America, although it is increasing. And I think that we probably will legalize polygamy in the 2030s if America is still around. Well, what about regulating our sexual market? What about having more social and maybe even legal constraints regulating sexuality to sort of enforce monogamy for us? To that, I say, for a society like ours that's used to lots of personal freedom, harsher social and especially legal limits on our sex lives would seem to be a big infringement for a small civilizational gain. So that is to say, sexlessness and young male sexlessness in particular might be a big problem, but it's very unclear whether or not male intrasexual competition is the major cause, or whether alleviating that is the most efficient way to address the problem. So do we have a lot of males who are dropping outside because they just can't get girls and they're dispirited? Yes, that's a big problem. Is the main driver of that intrasexual male competition? Doesn't seem so. Okay, and even incels admit this, right? So this is a great meme, a very self-conscious meme that I saw in the incel community talking about, look, a lot of this is because we're jerking ourselves off to oblivion, and we are thus not as interested in approaching girls in real life. Okay, and so that's a big problem, and that problem is not solved by alleviating male competition. So what I think we should be doing, and this is my last slide, to maintain our freedoms, but to achieve a more sustainable mating ecology, we should first, I think, educate young people to these dynamics that I talked about in this talk. We need more comprehensive sex education, even if it's not politically correct, or even if it's sexist, or what gets called sexist, or even if it's sex negative, or what gets called sex negative, or whatever, okay? Educating young people to sex differences, sexual strategies, that they will be interested in getting married at some point, that they will wish they had kids at some point on average, much more often than average, and so forth. We should be teaching kids this, right? And then we should be teaching them how to become more desirable long-term mates, and teach them to be more empirical and intentional about cultivating and demanding those qualities in their partners, right? We should, first, we should try to educate before we legislate or something like that. So, and ironically enough, Jordan Peterson should be credited with trying to do this a lot, okay? So he's already doing that. And I think more of us should be doing it, frankly. We should follow his example in that way, instead of perpetuating ideas that I think sabotage our students' long-term mating prospects, make it harder for them to find a mate when they're ready to settle down, making it harder for them to get a mate now when they're young, etc. Teaching them that it's not going to matter, that it doesn't matter to them, that other things that matter much less matter more, or comparable. So I think that's been a really good thing but it's totally dissociated from this whole episode, right? But it's something that actually he deserves credit for, and I honor him for that.